Well, they paved paradise, put up a parking lot with a pink hotel, a boutique, and a swinging hot spot. Don't it always seem to go that you don't know what you've got till it's gone? They paved paradise, put up a parking lot. Ooh, bop, bop, bop. That's your part. They took all the trees, put them in a tree museum, and they charged all the people $1.50 just to see them. Don't it always seem to go that you don't know what you've got till it's gone? They paved paradise, put up a parking lot. Anybody remember that song? Yeah? You never heard that song, Nana? Wow. Oh, all right. Well, recorded in 1970 by Johnny Mitchell. The song became emblematic of the environmental movement that was catching on. Even though the song is really more broadly about how we lose the things that matter most if we just take them for granted, as if they'll always be there and don't really need to be defended or valued or cared for or nurtured. We just figure it's just going to be there. But that concern really does resonate with environmentalists today who are deeply concerned about such things as clean air and clean water and rising sea levels, who would say that our willingness to take air and water and sea level for granted is part of the problem, that we haven't been willing to defend, value, nurture, or care for our environment the way that it is needed to be cared for. And they'll say that this is why we're in the midst of an environmental crisis right now. They call for drastic changes to many deeply ingrained human systems in order to mitigate the worst outcomes of this crisis. But the word crisis, I think, is a hard sell. A crisis for most people is measured by what you experience and what you see in a moment. That feels like a crisis. It's something that gets your anxiety up right here and now and something you have to respond to right here and now. Like when a water pipe bursts in the basement or when someone's health takes a sudden turn for the worse. These are things that happen within a certain brief time span and make us go, that's a crisis. But an environmental crisis works on a different clock. And because it works on a different clock, it doesn't feel crisis-like to us. It's measured in decades or centuries or even millennia in order to track changes and make predictions about what's to come. And when you start making predictions about what's to come based on what happened, then you start getting into debates over other mitigating factors that could change the path, and it could go a different way than what the scientists are saying. And it all becomes a really complicated public debate, doesn't it? You get the politics involved, and you get the lobbyists involved, and you get the economists involved, and you get the environmentalists involved, and you get people with obvious agendas, and you get people who have different value systems and different ethical guidelines, and it all becomes this great big, what do we do now kind of a thing. One of the great problems that we have is when you have a beautiful day like what we had yesterday. Did anybody yesterday think, oh my goodness, the whole world is collapsing because look how beautiful it is? Was anybody thinking about climate change on the most perfect day that God has given us this entire year? Nope. And so because we can set it aside, it doesn't feel like a crisis. It's hard to imagine that there's this looming disaster gaining momentum. Rising seas, glacial melt, diminished air quality. It's hard to imagine this massive plastic swirling in the Pacific the size of Texas. The weight of it, WEIGHT, will very soon be greater than the whole biomass of the oceans. This disaster, it's too big to comprehend, and it's so difficult to communicate without the aid of Hollywood special effects. But those Hollywood special effects have become cliche. They've become entertainment. They don't really engage us in the way that we need to be engaged. And so when you try to talk about the big picture and people are saying, it looks more like a movie to me. So then you try to get down to those more local stories, ones that people can wrap their minds around, like the story of Tangier Island and the other 400 islands in the Chesapeake Bay that have been suffering from more and more flooding as the tide rises than they have in the past. And people will say, they'll take a look at a local thing and say, well, that's just a local story. There may be another explanation for it, and they won't take it as emblematic or indicative of what's happening the world over. How do you communicate what's going on? How do you communicate it to a point that it will gather people's attention and cause change? Scientists, policymakers are scratching their heads trying to figure out how to communicate the enormity of the data in front of them so that people will make substantive changes and be willing to pay for them. Isn't that the kicker? Doesn't it always come down to the money? We've got some really good ideas about things that we could do that will help our environment. Well, how are you going to pay for it? And then people start shrinking away and they don't want to talk about the money anymore. For a moment, let's take all of that confusing, tangled mess of the data and the counter data and the politics and the lobbyists and the environmentalists and the agendas and the this and the that and the other thing. Let's take all of that, and if you would, just kind of put it off to the side for a moment. Because that can all be very confusing. There's lots of ways that messages can get mixed up in there. And instead, let's just, for this moment, pay attention to what we heard Eric read in the text. That what the scriptures tell us is that God created us in God's own image and then gave us a job to do. God said you are to have dominion over the earth, over the birds of the air, over the fish of the sea, and every creeping thing that crawls along the ground, including alligators. And you're supposed to have dominion and subdue. From my perspective, as I think about environmental issues, I don't see humanity as much having dominion to subdue as much as trying to dominate and overwhelm. Dominion and dominate are two different things. Subdue and overwhelm are two different things. And really about the best idea that I can give you is my dogs. My overzealous, really happy dogs who love when people come to the house. They don't like delivery trucks, and they don't like when people go for walks around the house. But if you come up to the door, they will be the first ones to greet you. And they will come charging up to that door, and they'll crash the glass, and because they just want to get their paws on you so that they can say hi. That's all they really want to do. But here's what happens. You try to open that door, and you're afraid the dogs are going to get out, and so you kind of come into the house like this, and you close the door, and then you've got these dogs all over you, and the kids are trying to grab the dogs and pull them back and hold them in a better position. And I'm thinking, you know what? We need to exercise dominion over these dogs and subdue them, right? I don't need to dominate them and overwhelm them. I mean, to dominate them and overwhelm them would be to put shock collars on them, to tackle them to the ground, to hold them back, and to forcibly do something. But to have dominion over them and subdue is really more about management and caretaking, isn't it? Dominion and subduing is more about setting good boundaries and recognizing what makes for a happy person walking into the house, not one who's afraid that the giant big black dog is going to attack them, when you really have to be looking out for the little one. That's the moody animal. So finding a way to manage and control is really what God has given us to do. And God has given us this task not for our benefit, but for God's honor. And that's where we've gotten it wrong. We've looked at this gift that God has given as one that we can exploit for our own power and wealth, rather than looking at this gift that God has given to us as something that we can love to show honor to God, and looking after the whole that God has given to us as this tremendous, beautiful thing to love. Over the next couple of weeks, we'll expand on this, particularly talking about how economy impacts our environmental ideas. I'll be borrowing from one of my favorite theologians. You've heard me mention the name before, Walter Brueggemann. And so you're going to hear a little bit more from Walter Brueggemann's thinking about this. But for today, I just want to make sure in this hot day without air conditioning that you understand the difference between dominion and dominate. Yes? You understand the difference between subdue and overwhelm? Yes. And we've got Justin here to talk to us about some of the things that we can do that are more about dominion and subduing than they are about reaping and harvesting and taking and seeking wealth. But before I wrap up, where's Eric? I keep looking for Eric to talk to him. And did he go off with the kids? All right. So I'm like, I don't have anybody to talk to over here. I guess I'll have to talk to you, as I shift my attention around. I want to talk a little bit about that text from Romans too, okay? Because that text from Romans is, I think, important for us to consider. Paul says that the whole of creation is eagerly awaiting the revealing of the children of God, because it was subject to futility, not of its own, but by the one who subjected it. The one who subjected it being us. In our brokenness, in our, as the prayer said, greed and hubris. We have gone after the elements of creation to try to create wealth. And boy, I'm telling you, Paul saw this. Paul saw this before they discovered Roundup in the snowflakes at the South Pole. Is there any reason to have Roundup at the South Pole? Are there any plants? Do we have dandelions at the South Pole that we have to kill? Is Roundup that pervasive that it's even there? Yes, it is. So before that happened, before an industrial revolution, before worries about air quality, Paul was looking at the system that was there present 2,000 years ago, recognizing that people were abusing their power for wealth, and in the process were abusing other people and the world around them. And Paul said, we've got to stop this. And that message, along with the message from Genesis, has been sitting in front of God's people for thousands of years. So I want to ask you just this. Just do something. Do something different than what you have been doing. Make some change. I know that the debate on environmental awareness and climate change and sea level rise and all that is a thing. And it can lock you into a space and not knowing what to do. And I'm just going to ask you to do something. And I really believe that if we did understand this to be a crisis, and we all responded like it was a crisis, as if there was a fire and we all had to do something about the fire, then we would probably all ride electric bicycles because we're sworn off the fossil fuels, and we would ride our electric bicycles to farmers markets where we would buy locally grown and sourced organic product, and we would become vegan, and we would I ain't coming vegan, and we would put solar panels on everything and windmills on our chimneys and geothermal heating systems in our buildings, and we would drive electric vehicles if you didn't like riding the bicycle thing. But the bicycle thing's a great idea because then you're only buying. Never mind, I won't get into all that. We would make all these changes if it were really a crisis to us. It just doesn't feel that way. So I'm asking you to just do something. Make some change that you can. Maybe put LED lights in your house. Maybe recycle more. Actually clean the stuff before you put it in recycling so they don't reject it. Maybe buy an electric vehicle. Or maybe put up solar panels. Or these kinds of options. But just do something. And do it not because of the economy of it. Do it not because there's this growing pressure in the public square to do something. Do it because God gave this to us to care for. And our job is to look after the well-being of everything that lives upon the earth. Do it for that reason. And that will be not only reason enough, but the reason that honors God. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.